Hello again, this is Bruce. I've been busy painting some little oxen and horses for a couple scenes I'm making. And I thought that while I was waiting for the paint to dry, I would do a short video on something called jigs. Now, I'm not going to be talking about lively Irish dances, and I'm not going to be talking about bass lures. What I'm talking about are fixtures to help position pieces and to hold them in place during assembly. Yesterday, in preparation for doing some scenes for those horses and oxen, I needed to make some fencing for a corral. And although I have in the past used commercially available laser cut fences, I thought I would make my own, and since I'm going to be making lots of pieces of fences, it made sense to make a jig. So again, here you can see that this fence jig is holding the pieces in place and help lining them up for assembly. And once it's dry, you just lift your piece out, and there's your first piece of fencing. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why you would use jigs and perhaps how to make jigs. You can buy them. There are some commercial jigs available. Here's an example. It's a stair construction jig that was supplied by Rusty Stump's Scale Models in one of their kits that had quite a few sets of steps to be assembled. All it is slots to hold the stair risers. So you can see here's one set of stair risers, and I think you can see that this slot that they have made will just hold the material that the risers are made out of. So you pop out two sets of risers, and you put them in whichever two slots you want. The first two slots here are 2 feet apart, which when you let the stairs extend a little bit in each direction gives you about a 3-foot wide set of steps. And the outer two slots are 3 feet apart, which will give you about a 4-foot wide set of steps. And if you've ever tried to assemble a set of steps without using a jig, you know what frustration is. First one side of the riser is flopping over and then the other, and it's just hard to get them to hold still. You really need extra sets of hands, and that's what a jig provides. It locates these things, the risers, and it holds them in place. Now, besides commercially available jigs, you can certainly make your own, and over the years I've made quite a number. The ones I could lay my hands on quickly are the ones that are laying in front of me. There's the stair jig that was purchased, but here's the fence jig that I made yesterday. You can notice it's made out of styrene. We'll talk about why I choose certain materials in a minute. This little jig to make ladders, I have used an unbelievable number of times to make ladders for my models. And I'll talk to you about how I made that. Here's a wooden jig that's to make caboose steps. Now, I didn't have to make a lot of caboose steps, but I needed to make some out of brass, which required soldering, which means you have a hot tip. And so instead of using styrene to make the jig, which a hot tip might melt, I used wood. Talk about what that does. And this little jig helps me make stirrup steps for freight cars. So let's talk about the choice of materials. Normally I build in wood. My ladders are made out of wood, my fences are made out of wood, and so styrene is a natural choice then because wood glue does not adhere to the styrene. If I made my jig out of wood and was building ladders and fences out of wood, and some of that wood glue got onto the jig, you would have a very difficult time popping the piece out. I already told you why I chose wood here for this caboose step jig, because of the hot soldering irons. But what I did was I took a little piece of brass plating and laid it along this edge, and that became the step. I cut it to the size of the step, and these two slots I put in the brass strapping that would attach the step to the caboose body. So lay down the caboose step piece first, lay these straps on top of it, have them the solder ready, touch a piece of solder on each one, and then you can lift it out of the jig. Now what you have doesn't look like a step yet because everything is in the same plane, but if you now just bent that step 90 degrees, you have a typical caboose step. This is a slightly different kind of jig. What it does is it helps form. It's really more like a forming jig for stirrup steps on box cars and any other kind of freight car. I start with a piece of brass wire. I hammer it flat to make a strap by tapping it lightly on a small anvil. Then I lay that across here and push that strap down into this crevice and make it into a nice square step at the bottom. Then fold the tops over a little bit, pop it out, and glue it onto your freight car, and you have a stirrup step. This ladder jig, I realized that making a ladder freehand, which I tried once, is an exercise in frustration. Not only do the sides of the ladder keep moving, but it's hard to position the steps equally distant apart and perpendicular to the sides of the ladder. So what I did to make this jig was I had a commercial ladder that I liked, that I had bought, and I laid it on this piece of styrene, and then I glued these two pieces of styrene, and I don't know if you can see, but these are angle pieces, right angles, like angle iron, but out of styrene, and I glued these two tight to the outside of that legs of that commercial ladder. Then, still leaving the ladder in place, I had cut all these pieces of angle and styrene angle stock to the dimension to fit in between here, and small enough widthwise like this so that the sides of the ladder would still fit inside these two pieces of styrene. So you lay down the outer ones, and now I took these and glued them tight up to the steps of the commercial ladder. That spaced them all out evenly, and now I have a jig. Lift out that commercial one, and now I can put my own wood in here, and like I say, I've made many sets of ladders out of this. This is to remind me that it's scale, and HO scale, 2-inch stock. So 2x4 sides normally, and that will fit in there perfectly. And then most of the time I use 2x3s for the rungs. I used to have a piece of styrene glued to the bottom here so that I could just slip the ladder sides in and they would butt against this. And then one day I needed to make a big ladder. I needed to make the ladder to go up the side of that oil derrick, and that's a lot longer than this jig. So I removed that bottom piece, and then I would make, I had 2x4s, the length of this ladder, and I would make this long length and then move it down and glue the steps on the next piece and then move it down and so forth. And I'll probably leave that bottom stop off. I think it's not needed. And then finally this fencing jig. Again, I took a piece of sturdy styrene, that's about .080, to use as the base. I decided I was going to use a 1/16 by a 1/16 fractional lumber for the upright posts, and 1/32 by a 1/16 for the rails on the fence. And the reason I chose this instead of 4x4s and 2x6s and so forth is that fractional lumber, like a 1/16 by a 1/16 and a 1/32 by a 1/16, is a lot less expensive to buy, and it still looks quite good in terms of its scale in HO scale. So again, it's the choice was I'm going to make it out of wood, the fencing, so I use styrene for the jig, and I am marking down what size timbers I'm going to use so that everything fits fine. When I pick this up 6 months, 8 months from now, I'll remember what's going on. And I made it long enough to make 32 feet of fencing at a time. So again, how do you start making it? I laid it out in pencil, as you can see. And I started by putting these vertical pieces in for the posts. I carefully, because having this in hand, and without anything else glued on right away, I can hold the square up against it. So I glued one piece here, one along that vertical line, one here, one here, one here. Then I took some of that 1/16 by 1/16 and laid it against that, and then took the next piece of the jig and just tightly laid it down adjacent to this, and that's how I got my spacing to give me these slots that the wood would fit right into. To do the rails, I again positioned a few of them very carefully along the lines I had drawn, probably 2 of them, and then once they were dry, took a metal straight edge and held it between those 2 and glued the other 2 in place. And once they were done, I could take a piece of the wood that was the right thickness, this 1/32 by 1/16, held it up against those, and then glued the other pieces in. And then did something the same on the bottom. So these, you can make this jig. I think it took me probably about 20 minutes and I had the jig done. And I'll use it over and over and over again. So jigs, not difficult. All you have to do is think, am I building something that is going to be very difficult to do freehand, and is it something that I'm likely to make over and over again? If so, think of making a jig. Okay, that's it for now.